Welcome back, everyone. We would begin with our very first panel discussion on the topic, the increasing role of ESG and investor activism in M&A deals. Karen Thomas Bland will be moderating the panel. Our guest speakers for this panel discussion are Chadha, Karl, Rego, and Leppard. I would also like to mention that please feel free to share any questions that you may have in the Q&A box, and we will make sure to take them at the end of the session. So over to you, Karen.
Thank you, Akanksha. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I thought we'd start this session with a few intros from the panelists so you can get to know them, and then we'll go into a panel discussion. What I do want to do is make sure there's 10 minutes at least at the end for questions. So with that, Ange, can I ask you to introduce yourself first?
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'll keep it brief. My name is Chadha. I run a company called Top Tier Impact Strategies. We're part of Top Tier Impact Group, which is a group consisting of 600 investors, entrepreneurs, and professionals, all in the ESG and impact space. And Top Tier Impact Strategies is a global ESG consultancy. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ange. Karl, over to you.
Hi, good morning. My name is Karl Rego. I'm a chairman, board advisor, and investor. I run a firm called London Executive Advisors, and we deliver growth and impact for companies. My background is I've spent my entire career in the impact space, first as a director and executive at Johnson & Johnson Medical Devices, then as an advisor to sustainability advisor to FTSE 100 and other global brands, and more recently as an impact investor, having deployed hundreds of millions of dollars worth of investment into impact plays.
Fantastic. Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Karen, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Neil Lepard. I'm a director in PwC's transaction services business, so I help people buy and sell companies. I've been doing that my entire career across a number of industry sectors, but in the last 18 months, I've been developing our response to ESG in deals, looking at how to bring the topic that is now, front of center of every business's mind to life in the deal environment. So the topic today is very much at the heart of what I do and hopefully help clients with, Karen.
Fantastic. So finally myself, so I'm Karen Thomas Bland. I run my own consulting business, 7 Transformation, doing transformation and M&A integration. Prior to that, I have a consulting background with KPMG, IBM, and others. I've done 50 deals now in total. Particular focus is on integration. And what I'm finding is ESG has kind of flipped from, what used to be kind of risk mitigation now to value creation. So really interested in this topic. I mean, I thought as a starter for 10, and I'm sure everyone in their mind has a definition of what is ESG, and certainly much out there, but I thought we'd get the panel just to perhaps reflect on that. So Neil, I'm going to turn to you first. You're at a cocktail party and someone says, Neil, what's ESG? What would you say?
Well, of course, there's the obvious answer about defining environmental, social, and governance. But actually, what I would say is it's really now at the heart of how businesses understand and assess and drive their impact on society. So I think, in a nutshell, that's the phrase I would use to explain to people what ESG is.
What about you, Karl? What's your take? What's your working definition?
Yes, I agree with Neil. I mean, basically, on the one hand, it's about a company's environmental, social, and governance practices, right? That's just defining the term. So in practice for me, I think I agree with Neil in terms of looking at a company's impacts. I think it's basically, if we think about it, it's taking what I would say, taking a stakeholder view and a stewardship view, right? Or if you want to add that the classical people, it's about looking at a company's positive, let's say, looking at the overall impacts on people, planet, and prosperity.
Got it. No, makes good sense. Ange, perhaps I can ask you to answer that question.
I think, thanks, Karen. I think given we are a pure play, ESG pure play business, I will give a little bit more technical definition. So there is a big debate going on about materiality. So materiality is, what is material to your business, which is a very, very kind of well-known, concept in financial accounting, for example. So there is a debate about, does ESG mean the impact of those externalities, so-called negative externalities in economics, now impacting your business, or is it actually your impact on the wider society? So for me, it's both, actually, because if you are taking certain actions to reduce the impact on your business, you're inevitably going to help the planet and the people along the way. So it's a both side of the sort of coin, which European Union, talks about the double materiality issue.
And do you find, Ange, that the E gets more focused than the S and the G? Do you think they're equally weighted, or is it really all about the E?
I suppose, given the urgency of climate change and the loss of biodiversity in nature, E has taken a bit of a sort of front seat, which as a matter of fact, E would impact on your S and the G. So for very much, if you're looking at it from a kind of pure silo perspective, then you might say that. But if you're looking at it from a holistic view, it's very much joining the dots together. And I think S is as important. And you can see the G is very much the governance of the E and the S.
Yeah. That makes sense. And Ange, I think you were going to set the scene for us. I mean, we've got participants on from EMEA, we've got people on from across APAC. Maybe you could give us a bit of a feel of maybe the landscape, what's happening from a legislative perspective. Just set that scene, will you, for us? Where are we now, and where are we going?
Thanks, Karen. I'm about to throw some acronyms at you, but I will define them in a sort of a slow manner. So one thing I was going to make a point about also with the ESG is the long term in nature. So this goes beyond your 2 to 3 years planning horizon. We're looking at issues which are sort of 10, 15, 20 years ahead, how they're going to impact your free cash flows. So it's got that sort of relevance. From a regulatory perspective, as our attendees may know, that European Union has been taking lead in a lot of ways, but UK is sort of finally catching up. UK introduced, for example, mandatory climate disclosure for companies from April 2022 this year, which is next month. And initially it was very much on the public equities, but actually they are now also capturing private companies of certain size, certain balance sheet, and certain revenue, for example. And part of that, UK is also making, for example, transition to a net zero world mandatory by law. So first country to do so, actually. And then European Union has a current sort of quasi-regulatory thing, it's called NFRD, Non-Financial Reporting Directive, which was covering about 11,000 companies within the kind of ESG, from a factor of your anti-bribery and corruption, human rights, environmental issues. But the European Union is now rejigging that, and it's going to be called CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is going to be introduced later this year, effective from 1st of January 2024. So the companies have full 2023 to work on this. And that will actually now cover 49,000 companies. So scope, and that's a lot of non-listed companies. Any company over 500 employees, a certain revenue is going to fall under that. So this is the kind of very fast-moving regulatory space, and you can see Singapore introducing now mandatory climate disclosures from next year, Hong Kong catching up, and China is very much aligning with the EU's CSRD. So regulatory landscape. The most consequential one is the IFRS, the International Financial Reporting Standard Foundation's ISSB, which is the International Sustainability Standards Board, which now has taken in pretty much the SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board based in the US, the Value Reporting Foundation, the CDSB, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board. So this is a good news for everybody, because it's kind of creating one global ESG standard. But because it's IFRS, it's going to be the most consequential, because anybody using the IFRS accounting, I believe, going to have to use these standards. And basically what we're saying is the ISSB is going to create a methodology for companies how to look at the ESG impacts. This is the financial materiality, and then link that back into the IFRS accounting standards. So this is, as I said, the most consequential for companies going forward, regardless in the public and private space. Thank you.
Fantastic. And maybe, Karl, Neil, I'll just ask you, is there anything else you would add to that landscape setting? Anything else that you think is particularly pertinent, or things coming down the line?
I think Anj may have touched on this, but in the US, the SEC has also pulled a task force together and is looking at their version, or kind of harmonizing and aligning. Potentially, we'll see how those regulations come through. But yeah, it seems that basically there's been a sea change. The only other point I would mention, just from a big picture perspective, in terms of why this matters for everyone, all the delegates, is there was a manager from one of these multi-billion dollar say, green funds. And he had said, look, it used to be the case that in order to be sustainable, you first had to be profitable. Now there's been a sea change. In order to be profitable in the near to midterm, you now must be sustainable. And he said, look, there's no shortage. He was on Bloomberg News. He said, look, there's no shortage of capital. There's just a shortage of leaderships to deploy it into. So I think that's the challenge. The way that all firms come to grips with the sorts of regulations and requirements that Anj has mentioned. I think that's the gauntlet's been thrown down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just maybe if I may, Karen, just briefly to add to that, I think, you know, in terms of the landscape, I think that's a good setting, although it tends to feel very, I mean, there is so much happening. I think it's an area where I think many people, everyone playing in the space, feels overwhelmed at times. And obviously we do need, you know, this increasing level of guidance to bring some degree of consistency to what's going on. But I think going back to your point, Karl, actually that bit about leadership, I mean, ultimately, you know, we haven't got the benefit of decades and centuries that's helped to define accounting as we know it today. We've got years, you know, and actually I think what that does mean is that actually the leaders in this are, you know, one, obviously hopefully going to see a benefit from leading, but two, actually I think organizations and individuals need to be the ones who are driving this change, recognizing that over time the reporting and the compliance is obviously going to be what they're going to need to respond to, but actually this is not one that I think people can sit and say let's wait and see.
And just to simplify the narrative, right? Because I'm big on finding the simplifying the complex and find the simplicity on the far side of complexity, because we can't jump there. But in practice, and Anj, I'd welcome your view on this, but you know, DFT is reporting that Morningstar just cut 1,200 ESG funds from its listing because when they did a little bit of more due diligence, they realized actually they weren't aligned. And the North Star they were using was the 2015 Paris Accord, in terms of looking at science-based targets, and there's a lot of legal requirements behind that already at a country level. But what's happening with the Shell case and in other cases is that the lawyers are saying the precedent seems to be that while those Paris requirements are binding at a country level, a lot of the courts are saying, well, we're just going to cascade those through to individual companies when you go through the court. So that's what the direction of travel. So if you as a layperson wanted to, and Anj can give more updated sources on this, but that's kind of one North Star to look at. All those other acronyms and regulatory bodies and standards that Anj mentioned are really relevant in helping with all this. However, we just want to keep one thing in mind from an investment perspective, and in terms of what's going to be coming down the pike for companies, that's that they're going to need to adhere directionally to the same level of standards as the countries have already agreed to.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I want to take it now. That's fantastic in terms of scene setting and where we are with ESG. Let's now land it into an M&A context. So perhaps, Neil, I'll start with you. How do you see ESG and also investor activism playing a role in ESG, in sort of ESG with deals? What's happening in the deal landscape in terms of ESG?
Yeah, it's I mean it's a fascinating time at the moment. I mean, we saw last year, you know, a tick up during the course of 2021 in terms of people looking at ESG on deals. I wouldn't say it was every deal, but I would say whereas, you know, probably in the previous 12 months it was patchy, I think last year on most of the deals that we've got a line of sight to, there was at least some dialogue around it, if not, you know, a real desire or need to really dig into the ESG topic. But I think what was happening last year was a lot of organizations, a lot of companies were trying to work out sort of what it meant to them, and therefore actually how should they think about it in a deal context. And I think you maybe don't get the full answer to your internal question first, but you need to be advanced to some degree before you then decide how you want to play in a deal context. So I think last year, you know, certainly it was inherent, and we've seen deals where bidders have pulled out because of concerns over ESG, and certainly we had deals last year where sellers weren't as prepared as perhaps they needed to be, and bidders have come in, particularly with you know, debt funding, where, you know, that's a key driver of M&A activity in terms of ESG. You know, the sellers weren't ready. So I think last year was I'd almost call it a bit of a voyage of discovery for many people. What we're seeing now is you know, a requirement to do something ESG is becoming much more common. I wouldn't say it's on every deal. And I think there are some deals where people say, I'm not sure I need it. But actually, I think people have realized two things. First of all, you know, no one wants unexpected surprises. So actually starting to cover off this topic, particularly on the sell side, is important, because you can't create the past once you're close to negotiating a deal and a buyer puts a topic on the table that perhaps you haven't, displayed before. But I think secondly, with all of this, we're seeing the ESG narrative being inherent in the deal story for many businesses. Some of the obvious ones that are maybe driving energy transition or circularity, but actually, some that you wouldn't anticipate have an inherent ESG perspective. People have realised that the business landscape is changing, and actually, you need that narrative sewn into your business plan and your view of the future. But actually, it brings a big opportunity as well. So, in a short way, that's kind of how I'm seeing it at the moment in the M&A world.
And Neil, just a follow-up question. In terms of the elements of the deal, so are you seeing it in like the deal scanning phase? Are you seeing it in due diligence, and also are you seeing it in integration? Is it playing out across all three, or do you see it more weighted perhaps on the scanning?
So it is playing out on all three. I think ESG scanning now is pretty much inherent in anyone's assessment of businesses to look at. I think in terms of integration, I think a lot of people are looking at this and saying some of it may not be inherent to should we do the deal, but there may be some ways in which we want to improve the business. So that thinking gets pushed into sort of day one ownership and integration. But I think increasingly in the diligence phase, people are going, and it's what diligence is about. You don't know what you don't know until you've lifted the cover. And I think the view in the past used to be one of lifting the cover and looking for risk and downside. Actually, the thing now is looking under the cover and thinking, well, how can I create value? How can I do something differently? How can I reconfigure how this business operates? And so, it may not be something here that people are using to, should we say, assess downside risk. What people are doing is using it to assess the prospects of the organization, and actually, how it may play into their offer price or their plans for the business. So in summary, it is across all three.
Got it. Karl, maybe let me bring you in there. Any builds on what Neil's just said?
Yeah, sure. So my perspective is I take Neil's point about some companies, if they're part of the green transition, there's an obvious play there. My view, I was advising companies like IBM, Coca-Cola, McKinsey, Unilever, in the board level on these things. And my argument is that ESG is core to every single business. Every single business operates in an environment. Every single business has employees, suppliers, different stakeholders, wider community, government, regulatory bodies, and the governance. I mean, governance at a headline level is about how you demonstrating control and also prudent and good decision making, amongst other things in a business. So every business needs to look at it anyway. Just a question of how elegant and how elegant of a way are they going to be on the front foot or the back foot when these questions come up. Yeah. So I've got an example in terms. So a headline principle is where I'm seeing it coming up is in when companies are looking at assessing the compatibility of, say, acquisition targets. They always look at the culture and the values. Well, the ESG practices is really one of the main ways you can see how and to what degree the company is really living its values. And if you have two companies, if the acquirer is looking to buy a target company and there's a big difference there in their ESG practices, then you have to look at the reputational and actual impacts of each company independently, and then the combined entities. So let me give an example. So this is a example is a couple years old, but it'll demonstrate the point. So Paul Pullman tells a story in his book Net Positive about why he called it "Why Mayo Beat Ketchup," and basically it's when several years back when Unilever was a number of years into their sustainable living plan, which had targets such as doubling their revenues while reducing their environmental footprint and reaching 1 billion people and increasing their well-being. They were approached by Kraft Heinz, and they said sometimes a hostile takeover can be delivered with a smile. So the CEO of Kraft Heinz had just been bought out by a private equity player and Berkshire Hathaway, and it was Warren Buffett a couple years before. And under the new manager, Kraft Heinz had a reputation for being a shareholder prudent, like shareholder prominence. It's basically the shareholder first approach, short-term gains, that sort of thing, which worked well for investors historically. The Unilever investors, Unilever was thinking for the long term, they had stopped doing quarterly reporting. They were fully committed. They've been ranked as the top most sustainable company by GlobeScan for 10 years running. They were super committed to this, but it was a really attractive deal in the near term. So they had a bit of a crisis point there. So who came to their rescue? So if you look at just the numbers, it looked like an attractive deal. The shareholders may have taken it, but some of Unilever's former adversaries came stepped to their defense. So Greenpeace, who had previously scaled their headquarters building to hold into account, and then unions who had also had trouble with them before, but they came to believe in Unilever's model and their approach over the years, and actually spoke out against this acquisition. And also some of the high-profile proponents of Unilever called Warren Buffett directly and tried to influence them to stand down. So in the end, the deal didn't go through.
Yeah.
There was another takeaway for Unilever though, which was they need to do a bit more focus on short-term value creation to keep their investors happy. But that right there will show you how that deal was taken off the table because of incompatible business models and values.
Fantastic. No, brilliant examples. Ange, let me turn to you. Any thoughts to add in?
I've got a few. I mean, I was just saying, so people say, well, ESG, if you look at ESG, so one thing I mentioned is this is medium to long term. When we're talking about E especially, these are not simple issues. We are talking about, physics, climate science, and other issues. So for that, for example, we work with climate scientists, biodiversity scientists, and other ones. So you could not possibly put a number on. And I think rating agencies are kind of attempting to put a number, to give you 66 out of 100, which is a sort of starting point, but it will never tell you a full story around what E, S, and the G means. For example, if you look at any retail company, actually most companies, apart from if you're producing, concrete and cement and other stuff, or some other manufacturing facilities, if you're a company which has you're a multinational business, you're a retail business, you're sourcing from various countries, over 90% of your ESG risks and opportunities are sitting in those countries outside your home country where the head office is. So it could be sometimes misleading to understand that we could look at a score and a brief narrative and ESG is done. Actually, this requires a much deeper analysis. And the reason for that is you might see this today when you're buying the company, very attractive for the next 3 to 5 years. But in sort of the 5 years after the next sort of decade, the value does not look that rosy perhaps, or the opportunities are being missed. So what I'm trying to say is that a longer term view with sort of science-based view needs to be taken for some of these ESG issues. And I've sort of mentioned, there is a lot of uncertainty here. So there is, even with the climate science, there's a lot of uncertainty. Unfortunately, it's not good uncertainty, it's bad uncertainty. So what I'm saying there is numbers don't always tell the story. You have to talk to the people in the business, do sort of a little bit more investigation, understand more sort of narrative-based approach to manage these issues. So there is not a simple sort of answer where you sort of put a number in the computer and it spits out an output. It's not really like that. It's very much getting to talk to the experts, getting the right people engaged in the business you're looking to buy, and getting a holistic view. So that's what I would add.
Fantastic. You've given me two separate thoughts there. So first one is around benchmarks and good practice. And I think, Karl, you mentioned obviously Unilever as perhaps one of those. But my question is, I guess, what does good look like? I guess not everyone is A+, as we've talked about before. How do people go and identify what best practice is? And are there particular companies that you've worked with where you think they're like a shining star in the market? Karl, go on, Ange.
Sorry, I was just going to add, so is it for Karl? Sorry, I was going to just quickly add, so I've been working with in the kind of public equity space. So they've got a lot of focus, and there's a lot of data out there. So if you like, you can go to the company's websites and have a look. And there is a kind of pressure on companies to put a lot of detail. One resource I was going to tell you is a very interesting resource. There's a push for the open source data for public and private companies. It's called esgbook.com. It's a recent initiative backed by the UN, and many big institutional investors or other investors are kind of behind it. And actually, if you go into this esgbook.com, sign up for this, you probably see many companies you're perhaps interested in looking at already. They've got their details around ESG in a score. And what you will find on that platform is a lot of data and narrative. So this is the first sort of place where you can start seeing a good benchmark being an open source platform. It's not coming from a rating agency who's being paid to kind of review this. So there's no conflict there. It's open source data. Companies go on declare their data.
Fantastic. Karl, over to you.
Sure. So I suppose I can give headline principle and then some examples. I think what you want to look for is So okay, I've been saying for years now, companies can no longer afford to not have a view on this. So back, I think it was the RBS group CEO was in front of Parliament, and he was asked, "What's the social purpose of your bank?" And he kind of stumbled to come up with an answer. That's not good enough anymore. So basically, every company now, every CEO now needs to have a view that fits in maybe 144 characters, some headline description of kind of what they're about, and they need to back that up. So when I look at companies, I always check and see what their stated purpose and mission is, and how broadly is it in terms of the scope, in terms of what matters they're considering, and also the time horizon. That will give you a feel. So these traditional Milton Friedman-esque sort of mission and purpose statements about just to deliver shareholder value. Okay, great. That's an outcome of your core business activities. What are your core business activities that are going to deliver that? Keep a customer, create some value there. So I look at that, and I also think, and conceptually, I used to do a lot of campaigning in this space, right? And so how does this play out for companies? Well, it's three statements I would say to keep in mind, right? The exam questions are, from an environment and climate change perspective, how does a business continue to grow? How does a company continue to grow its business in a world of finite resources, and how do they manage their climate impacts? It's not just climate, it's broader than that. Okay, but how do you do that, right? And then you want to ask them, how are you doing that? Okay. And then secondly, if you look at from the S perspective, that's looking at workplace and community, but basically looking there saying, how is this company creating a diverse, engaged, productive workforce that's fit for the future, right? And then from a looking at the community side, how's the company engaging with the wider stakeholder community to look for win-wins? And really, are they inviting those stakeholders into their decision-making process? This feeds into materiality, right? You can sit and do a desk exercise, materiality assessment, saying, what are the most material risks for us as a business? You think about it. But once you invite external stakeholders in, you have a completely different conversation. So if the companies are doing that to have a more realistic view of what they need to be looking at, why it matters, and then you put a plan in place. So basically, the headline for me, I would always say to companies, you can't afford to not have looked at these matters. So for example, if it's D&I or climate change emissions, whatever, you need to look at it and then come up with, you may not be happy with what you see, but if you are, okay, great. But if you're not, you say, well, here's where we are. We're committed to doing X, Y, Z in this fashion. Here's what we're going to do about it. And then you disclose that. And that's basically what you do. So that's a bare minimum now. So what I would say in terms of world class is not just looking at minimizing your negative impacts, actually looking at creating a restorative business model that's actually, rather than profiting by indirectly creating some problems in the world, in environment, social, you're actually solving some of those problems in an elegant way. And so just give one other example, if I may. So you may say, well, I've got Mark Carney's book here. I think he's great, right? He was former Bank of England governor. When he was at the Bank of England, he said, we're gonna assess how well we're doing. We're gonna assess the expected carbon temperature increase based on our portfolio. And they said, oh, actually, the net increase in carbon, the net increase in climate for our portfolio is 3 degrees. Well, we're not doing well enough. We need to rebalance that towards 2 and 1.5. So they actually were divesting and rebalancing their own portfolio. So there's nothing wrong in saying we haven't got it all covered, because frankly, nobody is 100% perpetually sustainable now, at least to my knowledge. So I'll pause there. Does that make sense?
Sorry, I just want to make a very good point Karl is making. So one of the things I think, Karen, you're asking is, how do we sort of assess the kind of good benchmarks? Yeah. So one of the things, in our experience is introducing sustainability, ESG sustainability actions will create what I call competing strategic priorities within the business. Because if you're trying to drive out certain like carbon emissions and everything, it requires change to your business model. There's no kind of easy fix. So one thing I always notice is where the governance of these issues is. So if the governance, if the board and the senior management are part of this, they're incentivized to do something about it, that's a good sign that they're on a good path. If it's managed through a very kind of small department, couple of individuals, and ESG sort of, is part of the marketing department, that's a different level of kind of focus. So governance of these issues is absolutely paramount.
Yeah.
I could go on, but I'll let Neil come in. I have other points I'll make.
Thank you. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff in here. Just another perspective made to add in. So I think everyone in the world, to be honest, is feeling overwhelmed with so many things at the moment. Obviously, we've got some, when I look through what we're going through at the moment, what other parts of Europe are going through, it's incredible what the last 2, 3, 4 years have thrown at us. And the world is finding ways to deal with it. It's not easy. But I think people are feeling overwhelmed. And I think, the topic of ESG is another one to put in the mix. I think people are worried that they need to have the answer to everything, and they need a benchmark or here's where we need to get to. And the point is, as what you've already heard, actually what you don't have is, here's the 5 numbers you should be measured against, and this will give you best in class and that's where you should be. It's a case of there's a lot of data out there, as we've heard. There's a lot of narrative out there, but organizations, I think, have got to take that and reflect on it for their purpose. So I don't think this is about necessarily trying to say, well, I feel I compete with company B and C. I think it's about where do we feel we want to take it. And we are now reshaping industries. So actually that competitive landscape is not the one that it perhaps was even 6 months ago. That's going to change rapidly. And one of the other things, and Karl, you used a really good phrase around external stakeholders. Stakeholders is, I think, perhaps the key part of this, both external and internal. There's a lot of business that has grown up with, disciplinary functions who work out how to do something and tell you what to do. Actually, this is now, across businesses, across countries, across the world. And so actually it's companies finding a way to go, not just how do I measure something relative to a small number of metrics, but actually how do I really permeate it through? And I think that goes to the heart of your point, Ange, around if it's driven by the C-suite, they've got clear metrics. Of course, that's got a cascade and that gets more complex as you move down. But that has to be the way in which I think you've got that support at the right level to drive that change.
And just on the benchmarking point, if I may, so I used to run a benchmark for ESG. It was published in the Financial Times. We had a lot of listed companies in there, and we assessed companies along 3 dimensions. We looked at their strategy, management, and impact in this space. And we would ask them to bring receipts, right? We would look at board meeting minutes and say, okay, how often is the company thinking about discussing these sorts of ESG risks at board level rather than in just some subcommittee? Who owns it, as Ange said before? Is the strategy looking at how the company can potentially leapfrog competitors, or is it more playing defense and saying how are we going to fight off attacks and things like that? From a management perspective, everyone talks about proverbially what gets measured gets managed. So what are they measuring? What metrics do they have in place? Because companies have been at this for a while now. So if a company is just starting out, let's say, I have an example for kind of a health and wellness metric. So this comes from Mars, but we used to campaign on health and well-being and getting companies to publicly disclose that. But if you're just rolling out a new campaign as a company, you say, well, you can start with awareness metrics. How many people know? How many employees know that we have this program? And then you start with participation metrics. What's the uptake? And then you look at the impact. What's the body mass index? And if they have an exercise program or something like that, that's a way you can roll that out over multiple years and actually see how you're doing and have demonstrated improvement. Which is the other point. When you get to impact, well, we would benchmark companies. We'd say we want to see 3 years of performance improvement in, let's say, carbon emissions reductions, and we want to look at maybe absolute rather than relative. We want to look at your outcome targets, so you're reducing carbon. Then we want to know do you have process targets that says how we're going to do that. We're going to get our buildings green certified. We're going to switch to more renewables. How are we actually doing that? That process will let you stay on track rather than just setting a big target for 5 or 10, 20 years out past your CEO's tenure, and they just hand it over to someone else. So that's some of the things. So, but you can't fake that to the point I think you said, Neil. When you get to the M&A to the DD discussion, you either have the receipts or you don't. And so I would encourage companies to start putting those metrics in place and be clear on why they're choosing the metrics they are. It's not about compliance per se. I'd say it's about going beyond compliance and performance because that will differentiate you from the perspective of capturing opportunities, probably cost saving, and also give you a bit of protection in theory from future litigation.
So one thing I was going to add is, when talking about benchmarks, so there are now specific, initiatives like SBTI, Science-Based Targets Initiative. I'm talking about specifically E, and this has become like a gold standard. So many companies will use that, and that's a good thing for investors or people looking to buy companies because that gives you a external, qualified view of where the company is. So that's sort of, like a gold stamp you're getting to kind of set your kind of thing. Secondly, I was going to make a quick point about, I was reading that this recruitment business said last year, UK companies created 35,000 ESG jobs. And this is in the middle of the pandemic, you see. So, you might say, well, actually, this company has an ESG person, but we don't have that much skills out there. ESG and G, as we said, they're very diverse issues. E is very complex, it's kind of scientific based. So when you're looking at that, and like kind of Neil is saying, if you're looking for, value creation opportunities, one must look beyond just the kind of appointment of an ESG person or just having a kind of benchmark. It requires understanding the strategy, the governance, where the company is going. Are there any steps already taken towards that? So what it means is it requires a little bit more diligence than simply looking at a number.
So you, Ange, that's a perfect segue into my next question, which was about skill set. So if I put myself in the position, and I've been in this position, of many people listening into this panel, they'll be responsible for, say, creating a deal team or pulling an integration team together. So from an ESG perspective, and I've been here, how do I think about skill sets that I need both in the deal team and the integration team to make sure I'm covered from an ESG perspective? Maybe Neil, why don't I go to you first? How do you at PwC think about that?
Yeah, very pertinent. So the way we've been operating is we've basically realised that in the past people have grown up with a small group of people or a team who can deliver a subject. This is not deliverable by one or a small number of people. So when we're trying to put together the right capabilities to support a client with a deal, we'll be looking at what are the areas. If you're looking at a materiality map of a company from ESG, what are the important areas? What capabilities do you need to cover those areas? To what extent may existing advisors or our client have the knowledge and the capabilities of doing that? And where are the gaps that you need to bring in, which might be either additional people, but it might simply be identifying knowledge gaps or areas. So, for instance, if I take things like take diversity and inclusion, a lot of the work that we're doing, if there is an HR work stream that's taking place, a lot of the diversity and inclusion work can be picked up by that team. And as ever now, that team has upskilled itself in terms of not just understanding the topic, but sort of getting behind the direction of travel. So I think it really does come down to that ultimately that materiality map and looking.
Oh, I think we've lost Neil mid flow. Maybe while we're getting Neil back, why don't I, Karl, I'll get you to answer that question. So skill sets, what do you look for?
Oh, Neil's back. Did you want to just wrap up your comment there, Neil?
So sorry, I think just as I was finishing it cut off. So really what I was saying, it's almost like a gap analysis of a team capability that you go through and working out, is it certain individuals that need to be brought in to cover something, or is it tapping into some specific knowledge or expertise that's needed to deliver on it? So I'll pause there for the second time.
Thank you, Neil. Karl, hand over to you. What your take?
Sure. In terms of how doing the DD due diligence and how we're running
yeah, I mean, it's about skill set, and I think skill set either in say I'm tasked tomorrow with building a deal team, or I'm building an integration team, and I want to make sure ESG is well covered. How do I think about the skill sets in both of those teams? Who might I need to pull in to make sure we're well covered?
Sure. So I'm going to answer this kind of tangentially and say, you would ideally want someone who knows what impact or ESG, what impact means and what good looks like. So for example, in the impact investment space, there's been a 100x increase in assets under management in the last 8 years, but there's not been a corresponding 100-fold increase in the talent and people who know what good looks like. So there are people who have worked in special projects, so people like myself, maybe Anj and others, who have actually been there at the coalface in the boardroom with these companies, Barclays and others, when they were thinking through how do we do financial inclusion, when they're launching mobile banking, how do we make it more inclusive, what are the issues we're solving, and how can it be a competitive differentiator for us? So people who take that strategic view on it, and who've seen it done well before. So there are a fair amount of people who have done, say, supply chain audits for H&M and other sorts of, I would be looking to pull in talent from some of the sustainability leaders out there in the industry. So that it's known that some of the leading retailers back in the day, Marks and Spencer used to be a leading one in their supply chain practices. Unilever is in FMCG. I would be looking to pull in talent, people who have experience from there, and not just for the deal teams. I'd also be looking when I'm assessing the strength of the management teams and from an exco and board level. I'd be looking to see what's the depth of expertise of that team in this space, because this is if leadership is partly about taking people where they haven't gone before, right? And also strategy is about the fit between an organization and its environment. Well, all of these regulations in this landscape is changing radically. So you want, and as an investor, I always ask, is this team fit for purpose to deliver this business plan? Well, the new business plan includes all the stuff that Anj has mentioned, Neil's mentioning about, say the green digital transition, all these requirements. what's their skill set? What's the skill set of the existing team to deliver that? And then from a due diligence team, I'd be looking to pull people in with those backgrounds, for example, because they've lived it and done it. And there's a huge difference, if I may say, from those who've done it on a hands-on level versus just reading benchmarks, which only go so far. And Mark Carney's studies say the benchmarks disagree. So if you're looking at just a headline rating, they only correspond less than 50%, and sometimes only 20% correspondence between the E and S and G ratings for companies across benchmarking agencies. So actually needs someone who's been there and done it.
Got it. No, makes sense. So Ange, may I turn to you and also perhaps reflect for me on, it feels like in the environment space, at least, you're looking for people with quite specialist skills, perhaps also in some of the others as well. How do you marry together the skill set of the business and the sustainability? What's the optimum mix, and how do you make those skill sets work together?
Very, very interesting question indeed. Thank you. I think, so there is a business knowledge, very important. So if you don't understand the business side of things, how companies raise funds, how strategy is done in companies, how you operationalize things, how you incentivize, how the board works, and you simply understand the kind of very technical side of the E, that's not good enough either. So, for example, I'm talking from top-tier impact strategies perspective. We have people who understand business really well, but they carry obviously qualifications in sustainability, sustainable development, but they come from business background. They were MBAs and everything. But at the same time, that is not enough for us. We actually employ climate scientists. When we do climate risk assessments for companies and deals, we have a couple of climate scientists who work with us. Same thing with kind of the S issues. So we have people who understand human rights and supply chains. So we will, rein kind of the experts when it's kind of needed and giving kind of holistic view. Second point I'll make is one of the key challenges I find within the expertise is kind of having data in one place, the narrative and the quantitative. And this has been a challenge. So usually, as you know, Karen, is sitting in PowerPoints, spreadsheets. So if the board says to head of ESG, show me, what the metrics are, there's usually a scramble, and everybody's sort of trying to find the data. So one of the things we introduced quite recently is what we call an ESG 360 platform. So all the work we do, we give the senior stakeholders access to that platform, and they can actually see the data in real time, what's really happening. So it's kind of out of sight, out of mind issue from an expertise perspective. Third thing, and the last thing I would say is we've been running what we call the ESG Governance Workshops for boards and senior management. So appraise them of the nature of these issues, the risks and opportunities Neil was alluding to. These are longer than your 3-year planning horizons, and how they are likely to impact you. And what we specialize in kind of scenario planning expertise. So it's a kind of mixture of building our own expertise, getting the expertise externally. So it's like saying the expertise is finding where the experts are and how to get them in and then create that knowledge, which is useful for the deal you're looking at. So there's no point giving you a massive 3,000-page IPCC's report on climate science. It's actually distilling that to your context. And that's a skill I think it's going to develop. As you can see, it's quite a broad issue as Neil and Karl were talking about. So it's a journey.
Yeah,
I've got a couple of points I'll add, but
no, go.
Let me just
go on, Karl. All right, go ahead, Neil. I'll yield and then I'll come in a minute.
Yeah, thank you. I was just going to make one point, and I think just to amplify your point there, Ange, one of the things we're seeing increasingly is it's not that people need a separate piece of ESG work. What people need is all of the ESG related information and reporting to be in one place. So when a CEO or an investment director says, okay, what are the main findings relating to ESG? They're sat there and they're digestible and they are deal relevant. It's not the laundry list of everything ESG. It is the deal points that the investment director needs to do. Clearly, someone then needs to make sure that everything's been covered off, but that can be covered off by an HR team, a legal team, a financial team, but you need to pull that all together. So I'd amplify that point. And then just briefly, and then Karl, I'll hand over to you. I saw a question in the chat which relates into this about sort of who leads ESG within an organization during a deal. Actually, we've seen a mix of the investment team and an ESG team. But what we're finding is increasingly there's that recognition that it has to sit together. The ESG team may help to set out the topics I think need covering, but ultimately in any deal, you've kind of got one vision of what a deal is and what's important, and that needs to sit in within that central deal team. So I think what we're seeing now is ESG is being pulled into the heart of the deal, as opposed to being something that in the past has perhaps been two separate pieces. And I'll take a pause there, Karl, and hand over to you for your points.
Great. So yeah, just something we haven't really mentioned much about today is and when assessing the sophistication of a company and how prepared it is to take advantage of the opportunities and mitigate risks in this space is the central banks have published a number of different possible potential scenarios. And when we assess companies for how prepared they are, we can look and say, well, have they done some strategic thinking around at least a couple of those more likely scenarios which have been published out there by the central banks, for example, and Anj specializes in this. The other point I would mention in terms of what I've seen as the essential skill set in this space is that this is about transformation, business transformation, right? So change and transformation. So I always say change is evolutionary, transformation can be revolutionary, okay? And there's something about, so if I'm looking at a company to see the degree to which they can integrate, let's say if they're doing a transaction and integrate as a company and have a cohesive culture and vision in the space, it's what are the design principles for the new organization? What's the sort of organizational culture and operating model that they want to have? And how skilled is that leadership team at guiding them through that? And that comes back to classic kind of transformation, right? In terms of recognizing that the leaders of the transformation will need to be the lightning rods, and recognizing really that change is hard, and psychologically the ego cannot tell the difference between transformation and annihilation, which is why some of this stuff freaks people out. And so so be supportive, be there for them, right? And just recognize that's going to be part of the response and reaction to some of this. But those sorts of skills, and really a lot of it is about, I would say, the authenticity and the leadership team really needing to embody the values of the new organization, particularly in this space. So, for example, I'll give one little example. National Air Traffic Safety in the UK, air traffic controllers for lots of Northern Europe, they were my clients for a while, and they invited, I hope they don't mind me sharing this example, several years back, they invited their exco together to have a discussion about their sustainability practices and performance. And they gave every executive a little envelope in the middle of the meeting, and they asked them to open it up. And in the envelope was a little paper footprint proportionate to the size of based on the mode of transport that each exec had taken. They gave them a little footprint. So said, oh, someone took a big guzzling plane here. So they had a big, huge footprint, and the other ones had little tiny little footprints there. And that was a way to get a conversation started there. But so that sort of thing is kind of how you can engage people and actually hold them accountable, and be willing to have that discussion at the board level and call people out on it. Self-reinforcing, high-performing teams and cultures are self-reinforcing in the positive sense. I'll pause there, but those are some of the things I'd like to see.
I'll make just one last comment here. Is what I've sort of come across is the work with the senior management team. It's impacting every part of business. So this is not as I think Neil was saying before, it's not sitting in the ESG team itself or sustainability team. It will affect the finance department because they're going to have to write the checks here. It affects the businesses because they need to go and exploit these opportunities and mitigate the risks. It will impact the kind of risk issues. So the people, when we work with, although we have, say, one stakeholder we deal with, we actually have 6-7 different stakeholders at a kind of governance, corporate level, who will make the ESG happen. So this is not a one sort of department issue. It cuts across the business itself.
Fantastic. So one last final question, believe it or not, with 3 more minutes before we turn over to questions. So anyone listening, please be thinking about your questions, but I'll ask the final one of the panelists. So thinking about perhaps what's the 1 or 2 recommendations that you'd have for attendees today who are practically thinking about, how do I manage ESG? How do I think about investor activism in the deals that they've got going in? A quick fire round, kind of 30 seconds, a minute each. Neil, I'm going to start with you. Give us your 2 penneth of advice.
Yeah, so 2 things, I think. One is make sure this topic gets to the heart of the deal. It's not on the outside. And the second one, I think, is make sure that all relevant stakeholders are consulted and involved to the extent needed. They're my 2 points.
Fantastic. Anj, I'm going to turn to you next. What's your advice for people attending today?
I think somebody I was listening to, the good thing would be if you're looking to buy a company, you look at, is that company making money by being part of the problem, or is this company is going to be part of the solution for providing solution to the world problems we're going to be facing. So that's where I think the alpha will be sitting for you.
Fantastic.
I think from a pragmatic, practical perspective, what I used to always love to do was meet the senior teams, meet the CEOs and or the leadership teams, and ask them these sorts of questions about what is the purpose of their business? How is it making the world a better place? How are they serving their broader stakeholders in addition to shareholders? Because in the long term, that's how businesses remain viable. And then ask them the questions, and then listen to see how fluently they describe it. So have they got the answer down to 144 character, really pithy, we own this? And then the follow-up questions, okay, great. And tell me a bit about how you do that. How are you doing that? Show me some receipts. How long have you been doing it? And what sort of results have you been getting over the last 3-5 years in this space? Or did you just wake up in the last 3 months and realize, oh shoot, we got to do something about this? And that's okay if that's where you are, but that's how you can separate the wheat from the chaff.
Fantastic. And I suppose I lied. There is one final question. I mean, you guys have referenced, I think, great resources. I think it'd be wonderful if we could just pull together those resources. So for people listening in who want to find out more, just what are those go-to places for ESG? We don't necessarily need to run through those now. And I know you've mentioned some fantastic ones, but I think it'd be nice to have just a bit of a resource library of, I want to find out more, can we do this? But with that, I will turn over to questions from attendees. So what questions do we have? Now, maybe I'm not looking at the questions in the chat. And Neil, you obviously were. Any questions we can pick up in the chat?
There is, and there's a good question you just asked. Good questions come in saying, would you analyse or investigate the target company's suppliers' ESG? Oh, thank you. That's great. So, and this was the point I was going to try and make during the talk, but as ever, I think there's so much to talk about here that I didn't want to try and add something else in. But I think what we are finding increasingly now is actually sustainable supply chains and reconfiguration of supply chains is probably going to be one of the big themes that I think is going to develop over the next few years. And again, I think it comes both from I was going to call it a compliance perspective, but actually, does the supply chain operate in a way that the target company should have them operating alongside it, and will it be able to meet the requirements going forward? So, what we haven't touched on today is Scope 3 emissions, but I think that's one of the big elephants in the room in terms of the amount of work that's going to be needed by companies to capture and report on that information, and that very much has an impact on the supply chain. So we would look at it during the DD, but again, if I bring it back to a value creation lens, actually reconfiguration of supply chains is probably one of the large opportunities. One of the deals we've done earlier this year had a business which the target company recognized that its existing supply chain probably wasn't going to meet the characteristics that would be required going forward. But as we were debating this with them, and we looked at things like circularity of their product as it's meets the end of its useful life for someone, but actually can be recycled, you can create a whole different way in which your supply chain operates. You can put in place improved information to understand what you're procuring from where, how it's being used, and how you then get it returned. So again, it comes back to a big value creation opportunity. So in simple terms, yes, during DD, you obviously want to ensure you're not investing in someone who's got a supply chain problem, but actually you put this into part of your value creation bucket.
Yeah.
Thanks, Neil. I mean, I was going to quickly add is this is the kind of work, Karen, we do a lot with supply chains, and the reason Neil is going to highlight is I'm just looking at it, about 80% of total emissions for most business sectors are sitting in Scope 3. So we did. So how do you sort of start with even with due diligence? Because many companies will have many supply chains around the world. So one of the things we've done for companies is we do an estimation exercise. We have what we call input-output model, where we can actually map at a high level where which suppliers are creating most emissions. So you find usually 80-20 rule here. So we find for this company we worked with recently that top 25 of their suppliers have nearly 70% of their kind of emissions in the supply chain, and most companies actually have not spoken to their suppliers about that. So there is a massive data collection exercise needs to be done. I'm not sure whether it's possible at the due diligence stage, but that's something you would look for, that the company is intending to do so, because unless, as Neil said, if you don't tackle Scope 3 in the supply chains, which also have physical risks of climate change, by the way, especially in Indonesia, Thailand and other places. You're literally sort of, flying blind in that sort of, if I may use that word. So it's very important that if you're looking at, I'm looking at automotive, retail, apparel, consumer goods, chemicals, fertilizer, packaging, these companies, most of them, 80% of the risks and opportunities are sitting in that kind of scope 3 supply chain.
I think just to add to that, if we have other questions, but I think looking at the S and the G as well, I think it's important to just look at the risk profile. So certain regions and certain countries are deemed higher risk depending on labor practices, government practices, bribery, corruption, things like that. So looking at the E, S, and G in the round, I would say just a quick materiality assessment. I'd say, well, where are the suppliers located? And then based on that, you'll get a rough sense. I mean, if they're all in the UK, for example, or if they're all in certain countries that have a better reputation, top level, many of them probably wouldn't be, but that'll give you a sense of where you're more likely to find some other challenges, where there may be differences in requirements and regulations.
Fantastic. I'd like to get in with 5 more minutes. I'd love to get in 2 more questions.
There's another question in the panel here. Sorry, Karen, there's one more question in the chat as well.
Can we put that question on the screen? Fantastic. So what are your recommendations for today's technology startups to keep ESG on their strategic priority roadmap? Karl, I'm going to get you to...
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, so I'm on the screening committee for the Harvard Business Angels. We see so many startup pitches every year. And basically, I mean, a lot of the startups we see are squarely in the ESG space. So they're helping people track what they call ethical spending, what's, based on all their individual bank spending, lots of other kind of sustainable finance plays, embedded finance, so embedded lending. So if Deliveroo wants to support some of their restaurant partners with funding, they can do that. And then basically from that perspective, you could also see, look at what the performance is of those other suppliers to determine the creditworthiness and or cost of capital. But absolutely, I mean, I think, look, it's what I said before, investors are all over this now, particularly for early stage companies. I've seen a lot of businesses attract so much attention just because they're focused in this area. So I think it's a bit of kind of like blockchain was before and other kind of hot areas. If companies are looking at it, investors want to do it. So there's a huge opportunity there. I think if you're enabling other businesses, if you're a startup that's either a standalone business or a feature for another business in this space, I think those are both plays you could do. So if you're helping track the spend, you may get acquired by a bank or somewhere else. And or if you're in the green space, for example, if you're helping with the green transition or clean tech, then it's obvious that they're doing it. But I think from a perspective of the likely impact on their cost of capital and attracting this to investors, they'll need to keep it on the roadmap. And then, frankly, bring the investors in and find out what they're looking for, what they want to see from you, and then also what the other stakeholders want to see, and fold that into the product design.
Fantastic. I'm going to jump to another question so we get through more. So who leads ESG within an organization during M&A? Neil, I'm going to put that one to you. Oh, I see we've got let's do that one and then we'll come to the one on the screen. So who leads ESG within an organization during an M&A deal?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, in the past, I think it has tended to be led by someone who had, ESG as their responsibility. But I think now, as we were touched on earlier, we're seeing this get really combined in with the core of the investment team. So I think, whether it's the person responsible for ESG within the private equity fund or the corporate, they will clearly have a say as to what they feel needs to be covered off. But ultimately, I think it's got to be, run with and led as part of the core investment team.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So just scrolling through the questions, let's do the one from Phil on independent micro e-commerce. So questions up. Is ESG directed at them or the supply chains for products based on the size of the market, would that affect investor values? And I'm going to get you to pick that one.
So independent micro e-commerce brands is directed all the supply chains for the products. But I think, what is sort of ESG? We've been kind of defining it. So ESG is where the action is happening. So where you're sourcing from, where they are made, how they are made, what are the impact on the business of that being made overseas. So the answer would be yes. I mean, would it affect the investor values? Of course it would, because this is what we're saying, so some of these issues are medium to long term. You might not see the impact straight away, but actually, depending on your time horizon of the deals, within the next 5-10 years, there's going to be various impacts according to climate science, for example. So the more information you have on these things, which go beyond the rating, would be better to kind of look at the investor value from that perspective.
Fantastic. So we have done the questions. I know everyone on the panel would be more than happy to pick up questions offline. So please do contact them. I've learned an enormous amount based on that session, and I hope you have too. So Kanksha, back over to you.
So that was an amazing discussion. Thank you so much, Karen, for moderating the panel. Also, a big thank you to our panelists for this fruitful discussion. We would now have a short break, and we would get back at 11:15 a.m. CET for a second round of panel discussion on the topic, cybersecurity and data privacy considerations in M&A deal making. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.